Hi, I'm Sonia Shukla. I've been a journalist and a fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, and I've been a lecturer. I have studied the India-China border, lived on it, traveled on it extensively, and my specialization is the study of Tawang, about how Tawang came to be a part of India. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. With the departure of the British from South Asia in 1947, India began consolidating its frontiers to create borders where none had existed before. Like the rest of the country, transition of the northeast frontier province border from the imperial to the nationalist era followed this geopolitical script. Thus, NIFA, later known as Arunachal Pradesh and as we know it today, including parts of it that had never been administered by British India, became a part of modern India. Tawang was one such region on the India-China border. And this is the tale of the takeover of Tawang. On paper, Tawang was claimed as part of India after the Shimla Agreement of 1914. But it was among those parts of the subcontinent where the British periodically forayed but did not assert their claim. And the Tibetan administration held sway till 1951, which is 4 years after the Indian independence from British rule in 1947. This was largely true on the British side, where New Delhi's influence, fully exercised in Assam's Brahmaputra Valley, diminished as the mountains climbed towards the Himalayan watershed. There was no physical British presence beyond Assam, but there were regular patrols that went up for imposing allegiance on the local tribes, and this was enforced through punitive armed expeditions that went up regularly in case the tribals offered any resistance. Even this loose arrangement was hardly enforced in the northwest NIFA areas, where the British influence over the Monpa tribal belt ended far short of the Himalayan watershed. The peaceable Monpas were all sort of followers of Tibetan Buddhism. They had a distinct local ethnic identity. They lived in Tawang, in an area called Dirang and Kalaktang valleys. And all these areas border Bhutan. On the Tibet side, the jurisdiction was lightly exercised, but it went right up to the borders of the monastic state because Tibet was an ecclesiastical state. So wherever the monastic order went, that is where their writ went as well. So they exercised this through the systematic imposition of monastic and non-monastic tributes. This traditional border prevailed for the duration of the British rule in India. Even the delineation of this border for the Shimla Convention of 1914, in which a linear boundary, the McMahon line, was created, did little to change the status quo on the ground because the British did not enforce the new border, actually. So the Shimla Conference, to tell you a little bit about it, was held between October 1913 and July 1914. Clearly, in those times, conferences lasted longer than a couple of hours, as they do now. And it was attended by the Government of India delegates, who was Sir Henry McMahon and Charles Bell. The Tibetan representative was Longchen Chatra, who had come from the Kashag, and Ivan Chen was the Chinese plenipotentiary. The Shimla Agreement was signed formally on 14th April in 1914. It managed to settle the India-Tibet border, and in the British territories, it included the district of Tawang, which had thus far been administered by Tibetan officials, was under Tibetan rule. But the Chinese plenipotentiary was unhappy with Tibet's border with China. And on account of that, he refused to sign the final draft of the Shimla Agreement. This is how the Shimla Agreement continues to exist today. The Longchen Chatra realized that he had, in fact, signed on the India-Tibet border, and therefore the Tawang deal would have to be gone through. His advice to the British Indian government was that there is a great deal of sensitivity about the Tawang area because it's very holy, it's a very religious place. So there was a lot of sensitivity. His advice to them was that it should be taken over quickly and tactfully. But the British became embroiled in the First World War soon after in Europe, and so the matter had to be set aside. It was not, however, completely forgotten. This was 1914. From the 1920s on, as China became stronger as a nation and more interested in Tibet, the question of strengthening the claim on Tawang was reinforced by British Indian administrators. Among them was a character called Captain G.A. Neville. He was the political officer of the Balipara Frontier Tract, which was what the formal name for the area below Sela along the Bhutan border was referred to as. In 1922, he tells the story of the British paying a tribute of 5,000 rupees to Tawang, of which 4,500 rupees was being transferred to the Drebung monastery in Lhasa. And so this provoked A.W. Botham, the chief secretary of Assam, in the early 1920s to say that the logic of this appears to be that Tawang, being a dependency of Lhasa, and Tibet being a dependency of China, because Tibet came under the Chinese suzerainty at the time, we are in a way paying tribute to China for part of the Darang district. And not to forget that Britain was ruling parts of China at the time. So this was a very funny situation to be in, and the irony of it was not lost on the British administrators. As the Balipara Frontier Tract became an excluded area, as it was called, according to the Government of India Order of 1936, and came under the direct administration of the governor from the 1st April 1937, questions about Chinese and Tibetan influence in the northeast began to become prominent once again. This was also a relatively peaceful time in Europe, right before the rise of Hitler, but at that point still relatively peaceful. So there was mind space in the British Indian government to look at some of these affairs. Chinese atlases at the time showed almost the whole of the tribal area south of the McMahon line up to the administered border of Assam as part of China. This is significant because today the claim lines of China in its India-China dispute go all the way up to Assam. The Assam Chief Secretary urged G.S. Lightfoot, who was now the political officer of the Balipara Frontier Tract, that the government of India must try and challenge Chinese activities that may support its claim to Tawang or even to Bhutan and Sikkim. Who knows where they will stop, he thought. The government decided that to emphasize the interest of British India in the Tawang area, it must conduct actual tours or collect the revenue themselves, since the mere reproduction of the McMahon line on Survey of India maps would not be sufficient to correct the false impressions which had gained ground in the years leading up from 1914. 2 expeditions were sent in to assess the mood in Tawang. Captain G.A. Neville went to Tawang in 1914. He was the political officer. This was followed by G.S. Lightfoot, who was the political officer in 1938, going up to Tawang with an even bigger contingent than Neville. Both came back with recommendations to set up an administration of some kind in Tawang. It may not be a formal administration, but of some order needed to be set up there. Captain Neville specifically wrote that a European officer should be stationed at least for a time at Tawang to show presence, to show British presence there. Neville, who remained in the Tawang region from 1913 to 1928, wrote a really prescient note that would be proved correct in the 1962 war. He wrote, "Should China gain control of Tibet, the Tawang country is particularly adapted for a secret and easy entrance into India." And it is now no longer a secret that, in fact, the Chinese came into India in 1962 and defeated the armed forces there by coming in through Tawang. Thus, although we have such a huge border with China, it was the Tawang area which China has used to ingress and defeat us in a military fight. Thus, Tawang, as the gateway to India, gained currency in British Indian administration. It was Lightfoot, however, who recommended most forcefully that the British expand their administration to Tawang. The Lightfoot expedition reached Tawang. The reason why I said that is because his personal experience also colored his view. So when his expedition reached Tawang on 30th April 1938, it created a huge furor. A big shockwave went through Tibet, and it was felt all the way to Lhasa. The Tibetan government protested its entry into Tawang. It asked B.J. Gould, who was the political officer in Sikkim, under whose jurisdiction these areas fell, that the expedition should be withdrawn immediately, were his words. But Lightfoot insisted that the boundary question had been definitely determined in 1914 and it could not be reopened now. And he said that I will not be leaving my expedition, I shall complete it, and which is what he proceeded to do. He returned to the plains to report his findings and recommendations. These included, his recommendations are really important because they were actually what was later on followed up much later. That the Tibetan government, his recommendations included that the Tibetan government should be asked to withdraw their officials. The officials were called the Sona Zongpons. The district commissioner in the area was called the Sona Zongpon, and his assistant should be immediately withdrawn from Tawang. With them, he said, will automatically disappear their exactions of tribute and forced labor that they were doing in those areas, and to withdraw Tibetan officials from Tawang monastery and make it a Monpa monastery, was his view. So inextricably were state and religion intermingled in Tibet that till the Tibetan monastic officials exist, the Tibetan influence and the intrigue that goes with it would not leave the area. That was his recommendation, and rightly so, as it turned out. His recommendation was that Monpas should be elected to the religious high offices of the monastery in Tawang. He recommended this in 1938. It took another 70 years for that to happen. It was only in 2008 that the Dalai Lama, for the first time, appointed a local Monpa monk from a local village there, a village south of Sela, not yet Tawang even, as the Rinpoche of the Tawang monastery. And this happened in 2008. To return to 1938, the acting governor of Assam, Sir Gilbert Hogg, strongly accepted Lightfoot's recommendations, and he forwarded them to the government of India, suggesting that administrative staff should consist of an agent at Tawang and an assistant agent in Dirangzong, and half a platoon of Assam rifles should be stationed at Tawang and a full platoon should be stationed in Dirangzong. So the difference between Dirang and Tawang is the Sela Massif. His point was that you still have the Sela Massif to protect you in Dirang. But should the Chinese come over the Sela Massif, then we would need a much larger contingent there. And that's why he recommended a full platoon in Dirangzong. His estimates of the total cost were pretty paltry sums compared to today's estimates, but they were obviously, it was a very large budget in those times. Rupees 41,617 in non-recurring expenditure would be required for these forces, and rupees 37,896 in recurring annual expenditure for running the administration, should it extend all the way to Tawang. So for under a lakh of rupees, you could have had administration in Tawang in the 1930s. Apart from finances, there was the assessment that the people of these areas are crying for a just administration and would greatly welcome our rule, that is the British rule, he meant, which they would be infinitely better off with. These recommendations were followed up the same year with a proposal to send up yet another expedition, while pending a decision on administering Tawang or not. They were waiting for the OKs to come from London. While they were doing that, they thought, let's have another expedition. But the rise of Hitler and Britain's entry into the Second World War led to an end to these plans. As the war in Europe came to a close and India moved towards independence, the British government of India managed to exert control over areas south of Sela, the massif that separates the Tawang Valley, as I said, from the rest of the Monpa belt. Assam rifles, posts and hospitals were set up in Rupa, this is another little place south of Sela, and Dirangzong. Dropping grounds were cleared for airdrops of supplies, and the locals were actively discouraged from paying any non-monastic tribute to the Zongpons who came from north of Sela. So they were basically told not to pay any money to people who came from Tawang, south of the Sela Massif. But the question of realizing the full territorial potential of the 1914 Shimla Convention and implementing the McMahon Line, which had been agreed in 1914, on the ground was left for the successor Indian state, upon whom the rights and obligations, it is said, arising from the existing treaty provisions devolved. Hampered by the partition of India, the new Indian government did not immediately enter Tawang. And the decision was taken to enter Tawang only after the Chinese government declared the 1914 Shimla Convention null and void in November 1949. This was considered a very serious provocation, and it made everybody sit up and look at this region all over again and say, look what needs to be done here. The urgency of the situation was further highlighted by the Chinese ambassador's refusal to recognize the legitimacy of the Indian mission in Lhasa and the trade agencies in Yatung and Gyanse in reply to an Indian government note of 31 October 1950. The trade agencies in Yatung and Gyanse were controlled during the British Indian times by British India. But now China seemed to be suggesting that India did not have those rights over those areas in Tibet. This was considered to be a very serious provocation. So soon after, two important decisions were taken. First, in November 1950, a small committee of military experts with a representative of the Intelligence Bureau in Shillong was to visit the NIFA agencies and propose the places near the frontier at the very border at which the Assam Rifles units should be posted. Second, a high-powered committee was presided over by the Deputy Minister of Defence, Major General M.S. Himmat Singh Ji, with representatives from the Departments of Defence, Communication, Home, External Affairs and the Intelligence Bureau. This was formed to study the problems created by the Chinese aggression in Tibet. In 1949, when the Communist Party came to power in China, one of the first things that it started doing was to take control of Tibet. And since India had never had a border before this with Tibet that was manned militarily, the Chinese aggression in Tibet did raise some alarm bells in India. So the Himmat Singh Ji committee was asked to make recommendations about the measures that should be taken to improve the administration in those areas, defense, communication. In fact, all the frontier areas, not just in Tawang. This committee was known as the North and Northeast Border Defense Committee, and it sent its report in two parts. But the part that is relevant to Tawang asked the government of India to establish a post in Tawang. The Indian government was clearly ready to move. It was just waiting for the recommendation. A reply to the committee's deliberations was sent to the advisor to the governor of Assam on 10th December 1950, instructing him to establish a post in Tawang. Without delay, were the words used. New Delhi's reason for hastening the move of administration into Tawang was that the Tibetans had in the past disputed this territory, as we have seen. And this was indeed a very strong argument for effectively occupying it before the Tibetans or the Chinese asserted their claim to Tawang, because there was now a vacuum in Tawang, clearly. As South Asia was witnessing the simultaneous rise of two nationalistic and territorially ambitious states, that is India and China, Tawang at this point was in the middle of yet another bitter winter. This was the year 1950. Already burdened under Tibetan rule, the Monpa tribals were also suffering the effects of the massive 15th August 1950 earthquake that had leveled many houses in the region. So this was obviously a very trying time. And just to give you a sense of how bad things were for the locals under the Tibetan administration, I will take you through some local accounts which say that the Tibetan administration at the time was extremely harsh. So Karma Wangchu, who later became an MLA in the Indian State Assembly in Arunachal Pradesh, he recounts the Tibetan methods of tax collection in the 30s and 40s. He says the Tibetans taxed the locals according to their land holdings and they made them work for free. They took away their agricultural produce, so the local people didn't have very much to eat, especially in the winter months. And if someone did not give taxes, there were punitive measures that were taken, such as jailing them, public beatings of the kind that you might see today in parts of Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. At the head of the Tibetan administration in Tawang was a Zongpon, the equivalent of a district commissioner. The equivalent of a circle officer was called a senior. These two were the main administrators. They controlled the area. The seniors were the people who had the job of assessing. This is the circle officer, had the job of assessing the people, what to tax them, whom to tax, how much to tax. So the locals maintained very good relations with them. When a senior came calling, he was served chang, the local rice beer, and very good food. Their office in Tawang was in the low-lying areas of a place called Gyangharzong. This is to give you a lay of the land, to make you understand the areas that India would have to take over. In summer, the Zongpons went to Sonazong, which was further into Tibet, some 50 kilometers away from that place, which is now across the border in Tibet. And in winter, they would move back to Tawang. Clearly, Tawang was lower than Sonazong and therefore slightly warmer. These were the centers of power in Tibetan outlying areas from where the colonial system of extracting resources as taxes for sending them into the Tibetan heartland was carried out. In January, there is a Torgya Puja that is held in the Tawang monastery. The Zongpons in Dirang would collect grain, wheat, etc. and send it for the puja. And it would be used to feed the lamas in Tawang. But the grains collected in Tawang as taxes would be sent off to Sonazong. So there was no major objection from the public who were carrying materials from the Dirang area for the prayer, for the religious purposes, for the prayers in Tawang. But there was some objection and a lot of resentment to the collection of taxes for sending them to Sona, because they had no sort of great sort of love for Sona, and so they didn't understand why they were paying taxes for Sona. And but anybody who objected was publicly punished. So there was an elaborate relay system to convey the grain from Dirang to Tawang. It was accompanied by 2 people from the Gompa, and at each staging post, the local village headman of that village would nominate porters free of cost to carry the material up to the next stop. So this was the scene in Tawang. And on August 15th, in 1950, as India was celebrating Independence Day, in the other parts of the country, a massive earthquake which is known as the Great Tibetan or Assam Earthquake of 8.6 on the Richter scale struck eastern India. The epicenter of the earthquake was in Rima, which is now in Tibet, but its reverberations were felt as far as Calcutta, and the trail of devastation stretched across the length and breadth of Brahmaputra and its tributaries. The British plant hunter and explorer, Frank Kingdon Ward, who was at the heart of the quake in Rima, he happened to be there because he was there on a plant collection expedition, has left us sort of a first person on the ground account of it. And as he was walking back from towards Assam through parts of Nifa, he saw the trail of devastation that had been left behind in Nifa after the earthquake. The impact of the quake in western Arunachal was much less at the time, but areas like Tawang suffered considerable damage nonetheless. No one is quite sure of how many people were killed in Tawang. There weren't any great accounts, not very exact accounts were kept in the area. But clearly the earthquake caused enormous devastation, shattering stone-walled buildings with slate roofs that had stood for ages before then. And there are also reports of certain geographical changes that came about in that region. The suffering of the people in the aftermath of the earthquake, which leveled many homes in the area, was followed by a cruel winter under the tyranny of Tibetan taxes. But unknown to most people at the time, local people certainly, there was a big change that was coming into the monastery town in early 1951. It was into this scenario in Tawang that a man called Major Ralenganao Khating of the 2nd Assam Rifles was leading the march of the Indian administration into Tawang. He was told, quite simply and straightforwardly, your task is to occupy Tawang. The advisor to the governor of Assam, a man called N.K. Rustamji, had issued these formal instructions to Khating. Now, these are the great heroes of independent India about whom we know very little. But, their contribution to the map of India will become even more clear as we go ahead with this story. Khating's orders were to impress power on Tibetan officials who held sway in Tawang at the moment, to convey that the jurisdiction in the area vested in him and not in them. For the local population, he was supposed to announce that none of their religious practices would be interfered with. There will be no forced labor and everything needed will be duly paid for. So it was a very benign entry of the Indian state into Tawang. The governor of Assam was Jairam Das Daulatram. His message to Khating was to conduct the operation with tact, firmness, and discretion. It sort of recalls to us the words of the Lonchan Chatra in 1914. These were the first seeds of an enlightened administration entering NIFA, some 37 years after Tawang had first been ceded to India. These early instructions by Governor Jairam Das Daulatram and his advisor Nari Rustamji of dealing with the local population with sensitivity would soon be adopted as policy under the guidance of the anthropologist Verrier Elvin, who sort of came to be associated very strongly with the administration in the state. Meanwhile, armed with this telegram, on 6th February 1951, Major Khating rode in with the intention of claiming Tawang as Indian territory, and he changed not only the map of India but also the fate of the people in the area. Khating's entourage was largely made up of Assam Rifles troops. There are sort of varying accounts of how many people there were, from 20 people to 200 people. But the important thing was that he also included some locals into his entourage as he moved from south of Sela into Tawang. Walking in alongside Khating was a man called Pema Gombu. He was a village headman, a man of great eminence. But Khating clearly, influenced him to join his troop so that he would be able to ease his entry into Tawang because he was such a prominent person from Tawang. Pema recounts his journey with Khating. In those days, most well-off Monpas from Tawang used to winter in Dirang. Pema's wife was also wintering in Dirang in the winter of 1950. Pema travelled to Dirang in January 1951 to go and see his wife, to meet her, basically. When he reached Dirang, he found the place abuzz. Major Khating was collecting horses for an expedition to Tawang. And Pema says he offered his horses, he had several of them, and his services to Major Khating and said, "I'll join your expedition." When the expedition was ready, they set off. Along with Major Khating, there was Kotuk Lama, who was also from the Assam Rifles. He was basically like his 2IC, his second in command. They spent the first night at a place called Sengezong, the next night at another place called Nuranang as they were climbing through Sela. And then on the third day, they had gone over the Sela Pass and had reached a place called Jung, which is just short of Tawang. Pema Gombu, like many people from the local Monpa tribe, did not see the Tibetans as being one with the Monpas. The tyranny of the Tibetans was clearly something that was bothering the locals. He says in Lhasa, it was clear to the Monpas when they visited Lhasa that the Tibetans looked upon them as second-class citizens. They referred to them by a word which was a pejorative, a derogatory term known as Grinda. They saw themselves as rulers, that is the Tibetans, and the Monpas as subordinate subjects, says Pema. So it was natural that Pema Gombu became one of the key persons that Khating used to establish Indian administrative control over Tawang. As the cavalcade inched up into the valley of Tawang, Khating rode on a horse with a trail of yaks and horses carrying several days of supply of food and ammunition. The troops, the locals, and the animals all moved along at a stately pace to give the impression of being a power that was coming to take over. It had taken 3 days and 3 nights for Khating, the first Indian official, to make his way to Tawang. Along the way, on several occasions, Major Khating would point to various landmarks to Pema and he would ask, what are those places? Because nobody had actually ever been there till then. So he wanted to be able to identify stuff that he had read about in accounts from British expeditions. So they were villages, mountains, streams, and Pema would identify those for him. The Assam Rifles soldiers recount they were extremely careful in ensuring that the local people were able to continue with their lives undisturbed. There is an account by Subedar Dil Bahadur Chetri of 5 Assam Rifles, who was part of Khating's team. The public, I remember, he says, was very friendly. They wined and dined us. It was a great experience for us. We would sit with the girls, drink together and stay on there and even go to sleep There was no crime at all. It was all a very open society. We were young bachelors and we had a wonderful time. While the primary task was to take over Tawang, the plan was also to establish permanent posts leading up to securing the watershed that made up the McMahon line, which was meant to be the border with Tibet. Very soon after taking over Tawang, detachments of Assam Rifles were sent with the civil staff on recce's all the way up to Bumla, which is where the India-China border now rests, and to Lumla, which is also at the border. Later, in about 1952, permanent posts of 1 JCO and 50 other ranks were established there. This course of cautious military takeover was combined with a relaxed model of governance. The policy was known as hastening slowly. It was called. It was being implemented so that the local culture and the local practices of the people remained undisturbed. Entry of missionaries was not allowed into NIFA for many, many years, and still is not actually. Even people from the rest of India who wanted to travel to NIFA needed special permits to enter so that an overwhelming presence of outsiders would not inhibit local customs. This is known as the Inner Line Permit and continues to be in force even today. The Indian government, however, introduced the study of Hindi as a first language for increasing the integration of that area. It was a tactful move that did not invite any protest because none of the local dialects of the various tribes in the area had a written script. So people were actually very grateful to learn any language in its written form. But in doing all of this, and with the intention of doing it peacefully, there was a lack of focus on military consolidation of the region. It was considered prudent that NIFA should be protected by a paramilitary force, like the Assam Rifles, rather than the army, because it was made up of soldiers who would be culturally sensitive to the local population, because most of the Assam Rifles troops came from Assam, and they knew the area, or at least knew of it, as opposed to people who came from other parts of India. So this was done to ensure that outside influence remained minimal in the region as well. This policy was a success administratively, but militarily, it meant that the government of India was creating a vacuum in securing the border areas with China at the time. No picture of the Tawang takeover would be complete without giving you an impression of the locals of the area. Sang Wangchu, who later became the Gaon Bura or village headman of Laudrung, a village on the slopes of the Tawang valley, he was about 14 years old when Khating came along the road past his village with that entourage that I described. Tashi Khandu, he was another local who went on to be the elected representative from that area to the state legislature. He has a vivid account of the expedition and the impression that Khating made on the locals. These are people who had earlier seen British expeditionary forces foot stomping to mark territory and were now witnessing the march of the Indian administration. I mean, history doesn't get bigger than this. There was a hurried excitement combined with keen curiosity as the Tawang Pas, as the locals are known, set about welcoming Khating. The British, when they had come in full uniform. They came in straight lines. No horses for riding, only for loads. Everyone walked, even the officers. They carried long telescopes. The locals had no idea of their language, but they presented them with sewing needles in the manner of the British. They didn't stay very long, barely a week. They went all the way up to Bumla, touched the border, and then returned and went back the way they had come. So their interaction, in fact, with the locals had been minimal, unlike Khating's. When Major Khating came, whole villages turned out to receive him. So there is a local tradition over there that you welcome honored visitors with boiled local eggs. Khating got quite a few boiled local eggs. There was a fair crowd that turned out to receive him. All the prominent leaders of the village had turned out to see who was this representative of India who had come to take over Tawang. And his passage had clearly been eased by the fact that he had a prominent citizen of that area, Pema Gombu, with him. But there was also a subconscious worry amongst many elders in the village that the Indians too, who were coming, would leave, and then the anger of the Tibetans would be visited upon them. After all, the British had come and gone too. So there were many rumors that were swirling around that area. The Tibetans had actually receded into the background when Khating came, But the locals worried that the Tibetans had left because of Khating's arrival. But Khating would leave Tawang someday, and the Tibetans would then return to punish all of them for supporting him. So this was the climate when Khating came in. But Khating tried very hard to remove this fear from the people's hearts. He would call local elders to Tawang. He would treat them to many dinners, give many locals parties where they would be entertained. He would talk to them. He very effectively used the elders of the village as local messengers to reassure the people, to send the message back into the villages, to tell the people to be calm and to understand that the Indian administration was in fact here to stay. It was also the first time they realized that India had become independent. They had no idea that the British had in fact left from India because they hadn't heard the news. There were no newspapers or radio sets in Tawang at the time. It was so remote, so backward. Khating, after arriving in Tawang, sent a report to the government about his arrival in Tawang, in which he noted the local apprehension about whether India was there for the long haul. He reported that the local people were quite happy, as he put it, about the end of Tibetan control and that they were flocking to the camp for darshan of Mr. Khating. But the locals' only apprehension is that India may leave the area again, as had happened during Captain Lightfoot's time. It appears, Khating says to me, that after the departure of Captain Lightfoot's party from this area, some of the leaders who helped the party were taken to task by the Zongpons, and the local people seem afraid that such a thing may happen again. The real test of Khating's political skills came not from the local people, but in his dealings with the Tibetans. His dealings with the local peoples were, as we have seen, pretty tactful, but they were nothing compared to what he had to deal with when he was negotiating with the Tibetans and getting them to leave Tawang. In his dealings with the Tibetans, who had to be evicted from their positions of power and wealth, Khating perceptibly saw the distinction between the monastic and the non-monastic tributes that the Tibetans were extracting from the people. He was most reassuring to the monastery officials and monks. The Tawang monastery is the heart of Tawang. So he was actually very clever in reassuring the local monastery officials and monks and telling them that he will never stop the monastery tributes, which the devout local populace were in fact very happy to pay. But he was ruthless in ending taxes that were being levied by the Tibetan government for taking them back to Sonazong. In a telegram to Rustamji, Khating said, as regards the lay officials like Sonazong Pons and the Drekhangs, the salt monopolists and grain collectors, I have not allowed them to exercise any of their powers and influence with effect from 9th February 1951. I mean, just to remember, this was within 3 days of his arrival in Tawang. He had complete control over that area. Khating handled the inevitable Tibetan backlash with tact as well as firmness. The Tibetan officials argued that they should be allowed to exercise their powers till they received further instructions from Lhasa through the courier that they had sent on 7th February 1951, a day after Khating had arrived in Tawang. Khating's response was a simple no. He says, no. Since the area has been ceded to India in the Treaty of 1914, there is no question of you getting instructions from Lhasa to tell us how Tawang has to be administered. Your rule is over. Khating threatened them with drastic action, but he also continued to look after their personal comforts so that they would not report to their government any ill treatment by any Indian government representative. So he was both careful as well as firm. The Tibetan officials were not ready to give up without a struggle, and they made some attempts to regain control over Tawang. And in defiance of Khating's orders of the 9th February 1951, the Tibetan officials summoned all the villagers on May 1st, 1951, to hear instructions of the Lhasa government. The Lhasa government had gotten back to them. With the exception of very few people, nobody came. If the mission to take over Tawang was an unalloyed success, there were two reasons for it. One was the person who had been chosen to lead the mission. Another was the clear-sighted tactics adopted for establishing the Indian administrative structures there. Khating and his team immediately began winning the trust of the local people. They did that by arranging airdrops for materials to repair the Tawang monastery and for those affected by the earthquake. Tawang was not amongst the worst hit areas in the 1950 earthquake. as we know. But he did not let that stop him from using the earthquake relief fund to create a favorable impression of the newly arrived Indian administration. He went around distributing rations, clothing, medicines, anything from stuff like jaggery, salt, which used to thus far come from Tibet. Everything was being airdropped. And if you will recall the contrast between how the British had seen Tawang, where every rupee, every penny counted, the Indian administration or the Indian government was in fact throwing in large sums of money to consolidate Tawang into Indian territory. The innovation of the Indian administration was evident as the governor's earthquake relief fund was used liberally to expedite the setting up of the administration rather than to wait for clearances for funds. The team was also sensitive to the sentiments of the local people, and they worked very hard to make sure that it did not make the same mistakes that the Tibetan officials had done. So they didn't use the locals for forced labor to transport materials without paying them. And instead, a lot of the airdropping was being done so that they won't have to use local people as porters. Khating's wireless messages sent to the office of the advisor of the governor, Nari Rustamji in Shillong, they show a rare political genius. He had concern for the local people, but also savvy to ascertain the high esteem in which the villagers held the Tawang monastery. He quickly caught on to that. Now, unlike today, where you have access to information, Khating was doing all of this assessment in real time. He was thinking on his feet. Among the first list of items for airdropping after the takeover, Khating asked for 10 bags of cement, 10 tins of lime for repair of the damaged monastery. Khating was quick to realize that the people of the Tawang area had trade and personal connections in Tibet, and they would crave news from the plateau after the Indian takeover. So the new political officer set about creating an alternative news stream, thus eliminating the need for the locals to go to the Tibetan officials. What did he do? He sent a request to the government saying, it will greatly help the administration if you could kindly arrange sending Tibetan propaganda monthly newspaper edited by Khating in Kalimpong. So there were Tibetan settlers in Kalimpong who used to bring out the newspaper about news from Tibet. That newspaper was being requisitioned by Khating to relay local news to the people of Tawang. Khating was a Tangkhul tribal from Nagaland, and he knew the impact that an airdrop would have on the remote mountain people who would be seeing such a demonstration of power for the first time in their lives. Tawang had never seen airplanes before this. And the advantage that this would give him over the former Tibetan administrators of Tawang. So Khating staged a spectacle. The airdrops also had the effect of impressing on the local population the might of the Indian government. So there were these people who could, the Indian government were people who could come to you from out of the sky, like the gods practically. The British administration had moved up to Rupa and Dirangzong in 1944, and they had carried out airdrop missions during the expeditions, but they had never actually managed to cross the Sela Pass into Tawang. So this was Tawang's first view of aeroplanes ever. The personality of Major Khating, no doubt, was a major contributor to the success of the 1951 expedition. His service record speaks for itself. Khating was an instant hit with the people. Pema Gombu, who knew him as Bob Khating, which was his nickname, a very popular one. So everybody in Tawang to this day remembers him as Bob. Pema Gombu gives us this account of Bob Khating. He says his attitude was really good. He was very convivial. He would sit with the villagers and watch dances with us. Rum would be there in a jerry can. Apparently, Bob Khating only ever drank rum, which he would bring along with him. The Gaon Buddhas, that is the village headman, and prominent citizens would party with him. The custom here is for a yak to be cut. Khating would always pay for the yak meat. He was very generous and he had great respect for the village headman. He says, I have never met any man like him. He brought such a change in Tawang that it was like he had turned it into heaven from earth. Given the remoteness of Tawang, the Indian government moved uncharacteristically fast in providing the area with the basics of administration. A permanent site for the administrative headquarters and the Assam Rifles post was selected and created. A civil dispensary with 12 beds was also established. Checkposts were opened on all the main trade routes. House counting of all the villages south of the McMahon line began, and village headmen were appointed. By August 1951, Indian administration was in effective control of all of Tawang. And it was Khating who had made it all happen without firing a single shot in anger. Khating was born in February 1912 into a Tangkhul Naga family in Ukhrul, Manipur. Even before he turned 20, early in 1942, he was commissioned into the 19th Hyderabad Regiment of the Army. He served in the Victory Force in 1943 and 1944 in World War II, on deputation as a volunteer in the resistance against the Japanese, and he took part in the Battle of Shangshak. These were irregular soldiers operating in Manipur and parts of Nagaland behind enemy lines. Khating received an MBE, which is a member of the Order of the British Empire, and a military cross for his efforts. So you can see why he was a natural fit for leading this expedition. The successful entry into Tawang set in motion a broader process in New Delhi and Shillong to consolidate and administer the Northeast Frontier Agency. A new cadre of officers was created. They were called the Indian Frontier Administrative Service, or the IFAS, in 1953. The conduct of the officers was rooted in the work of Verrier Elwin, the anthropologist who conceptualized the Indian governance strategy in a philosophy for NIFA. It's a book that I think anybody who's interested in the Northeast must read, which went on to become the Bible for the early Indian administrators in the area. Records show that practitioners and policy makers, starting at the top with the Prime Minister of the time, Jawaharlal Nehru, Nari Rustamji, Verrier Elwin, K.L. Mehta, T.N. Kaul, people who were associated with the region, along with cadres working at the local level, were in constant correspondence over the most sensitive way to integrate the population of NIFA. The IFAS officers were personally interviewed by Nehru, and they were specially trained to work with the tribes in a manner that they would introduce the benefits of health and education into the locals without infringing on their basic values, on their ways of living. This way of life continued until 1962. As tensions with China created strategic pressures, a more elaborate and complex administrative and military structure had to be set up in the heart of the tribal areas. This interrupted the implementation of the policy in its original form, which was a much more gentler way of administering the area. But clearly, the years of sensitive handling of the border areas had left a lasting impact, such that these people saw themselves as Indians even when India was losing the war in 1962 with China. It seems appropriate to close with the words of a local, Tashi Khandu, who said that as the Chinese came through his village in 1962, a village that had been abandoned by Indian administrators and by the Indian soldiers, he told the Chinese soldier who asked him, "Why would you consider the Indian state as your natural rulers and not the Chinese?" And Tashi's response to them was, "I am an Indian because the Indian government has done very good work here."